Hi, John Morgan here with the Keep Growing podcast. I usually try to keep episodes around the 30-minute mark, but this week we're going to be covering a topic that'll take us all the way from a childhood observation to tackling world hunger. That's quite a bit of stuff to cover. So get ready for a special extended episode of the Keep Growing podcast. Let's meet this week's guest. 27 years ago, Joel Karsten, an entrepreneur with a Bachelor of Science in Horticultural Science from the University of Minnesota, pioneered a unique method for growing vegetables in bales of straw. Now this method is being used by more than 2 million backyard gardeners around the world. Joel has written 4 best-selling books on the subject, since translated into many languages, and has traveled extensively to spread his method worldwide. Straw bale gardening offers real hope for people in some of the poorest places on earth to grow their own food in conditions where it has never been possible. Let's get right into the interview.
Yeah, I grew up on a crop and dairy farm down in the southwest part of Minnesota. And, if you're a kid on a dairy farm, you spend most of your summers riding on a baling rack, bale 3 rounds of hay for your dad, then you bale 3 rounds of hay for all the neighbors who your dad volunteers you for, and you bale 1 round of straw. For us, it was always oat straw, and of course that's bedding for livestock, where hay is fodder or food for livestock. But that's one of the illusions about straw bale gardening is you can actually use a bale of hay. If you can't find straw, you can always use a bale of hay. Basically, the inside of that bale is going to decompose anyway, so it doesn't really matter what the material is. But even as a kid, I would notice bales of straw or bales of hay that would get tossed against the barn if they had a broken string or whatever, and they get rained on, and they would begin that decomposition process. And 6 months or a year later, the biggest, tallest, healthiest, greenest weeds on the whole farm were the thistles that grew out of those decomposing bales. And then I would use a pitchfork. Of course, when Dad drove the manure spreader past, it was my job to toss them on the manure spreader. And I would notice that the inside was just this beautiful, crumbly, just absolutely gorgeous media, almost like soil that it had broken down into. And I would notice that as a kid and, throw it on the manure spreader and haul it away. But then 10 years go by, 15 years go by, and I graduate from college and I buy my first house. And of course, as a horticulturalist, when you buy a house, your first instinct when that moving van pulls up is to grab your shovel off the back of the truck and run to the yard because you want to see what kind of soil you bought, right? Dig a few holes. It turns out I had about an inch of topsoil. So, of course, as a young, just graduated from college and just bought my first house, I didn't have $250 to build raised beds like a normal gardener would have done, but I did remember these bales that used to lay by the barn. And I thought, if they grow thistles, there's no reason why it shouldn't grow a pepper or a tomato. So I tried to do some research on it. I went to the library. We didn't have Google back then. I know my gray hair gives me away. That was 28 years ago, 27 years ago when I did this project the first time. Went to the library and tried to research, and I really couldn't find much about this process of straw bale gardening. I found some stuff about the ancient Aztecs and how they used to have chinampas, if you've ever heard of those mounded gardens that they would have in their swamps, so that they went up and down with the floods, and they would grow vegetables on top of these mounded gardens. So I found some stuff about that and a few brief other mentions, but really couldn't find any good information. And so I just started doing some experimenting on my own, and I discovered very quickly that it worked really well. But then for the first 14 years, that's the funny part, John, is that was about as far as it went. It was a few friends and neighbors and some colleagues and, people nearby that were interested in it. And then, of course, I stumbled across, like everybody has their aha moment, I stumbled across a reporter from the local NBC station, and he wanted to do a feature on the news about this crazy guy who grow vegetables out of straw bales. So he came over and filmed at my garden at my house, and it just started to explode after that. I started getting so many calls from people that wanted to hear this method about how I did it. So I started speaking to garden clubs and schools and adult community education classes and that kind of thing. And I wrote a self-published booklet about it. And then that turned into a publishing deal with a real publisher. And the last 13 years, it's spread all over the world. I mean, we have straw bale gardeners in, every nick and cranny of the world at this point. So it's become a really popular thing at this point. Sort of people like to call it a trend, but it's been around. I've been doing it for 27 years, so it's a pretty long trend. And people who do it absolutely swear by it. They fall in love with it. You can just tell by reading comments on our Facebook page that people who do it, try it. A very common refrain that I hear on our Facebook page is, "I'll never go back to planting in the soil again. This has changed the way I'll garden forever," and that kind of thing. So it's a satisfying feeling to hear people say that. So that's kind of a brief synopsis of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you talking about baling hay when you was little, that's me exactly. I grew up on a 25-acre farm and spent all my summer on a hay wagon catching bales as they was coming off the baler. Of course, here in West Virginia, we mostly do square bales because round bales and mountains don't really mix.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. In your book, you go through the process of creating a straw bale garden, and you really can't just take a bale and start right off the bat with it. You kind of have to go through a process to get it ready for planting. Could you kind of walk through that process?
Sure. Yeah, that's kind of the illusion of straw bale gardening, is people think you're growing vegetables in straw, but you're really not. You're actually growing vegetables in very recently decomposed straw, which is very different. So we need to spend 2 weeks, essentially 2 weeks, what we call conditioning the straw bale. And what we're doing when we're conditioning it is we're actually growing bacteria inside the bale. Now, the thing about bacteria is you can't see it. So unless you have a microscope, right? So it's a little bit of an illusion, when you we're going to put some fertilizer on the bale, and this can be organic. If you're an organic gardener, use blood meal as a great source, or if you're a traditional gardener, you could just use lawn fertilizer, just inexpensive, high nitrogen lawn fertilizer, and you apply that to that bale along with water, a little bit of moisture. You don't want to add too much, but just a little bit of moisture, and that feeds the bacteria, and the bacteria will begin to replicate and colonize the inside of that bale. And I always tell people that, especially for us northerners up here, one of the biggest benefits of the straw bale garden is the development of this bacteria generates heat. And that's really the friction of bacteria reproducing inside the bale. When bacteria reproduce, they look like a long worm under a microscope, and then they split in half in the middle. They sort of pinch in the middle, and then they vibrate before they separate apart. And it's during that vibration it causes friction, and that friction generates heat inside the bales. This is what causes, your compost pile to heat up. And whenever you have any organic material that's rotting and it gets hot inside, this is what causes it, is friction from vibrating bacteria. And there's oodles of them in there. I mean, we're talking about trillions of these little tiny bacteria. And so they colonize the inside of this bale during this 2-week conditioning period. And then they begin to metabolize or break down that straw. So they take what last year was a stalk of oats or wheat straw, and they break that stalk of straw down into cells, and then those cells down into the compounds, and the compounds down into molecules. And now we have free charged molecules of things that people would recognize, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, molybdenum, zinc, calcium, iron, manganese, all of the micro and macronutrients that a plant needs to absorb through its roots in order to grow. And those become free ions floating around inside of this bale. It doesn't look like soil when you're ready to plant, but if you studied the biology of what's happening inside that bale, it has the same characteristics as soil. It has free ions that are available to be absorbed through the roots of a new root that begins to develop inside of that bale. So you could do seeds, or you could do a transplant right into that bale, and those ions begin to absorb through the root, and up comes your plant. So this is not hydroponics in a straw bale. We don't use the bale as a place to hold a liquid in order to feed the nutrients. The actual nutrients are coming from the broken down straw. It took a variety of nutrients to grow that wheat plant or that oats plant, that those nutrients were absorbed from the soil of whoever grew that oats or wheat bale. So those nutrient molecules are still there. They're just trapped inside the stem and the stalk and the leaf and whatever. So all we're doing is reversing that growth process with Mother Nature's toolkit, mainly bacteria, and then there's insects and worms and fungi and mold that all work together to break these cells back down into molecules, and then the same molecules that last year were inside of a wheat plant this year are inside of your tomato plant. The same molecules. So it's really magic of Mother Nature. There's a lot of biology that happens in this process, and it's, because it's so small and it's very difficult sometimes for people to understand. If they remember back to their third grade, plant biology class, they probably would remember some of this stuff. Osmosis, as these charged ions and cations get absorbed through the roots of the plant. We studied all that in school, but a lot of us forgot about it. And it really is a great demonstration of what happens inside of these bales of straw.
When you talk about planting the bales, once they're conditioned, can you kind of go through that process? I know
Sure.
the first thing is kind of the orientation of the bale. Does it go strings up or strings on the side, or?
Yeah, well, that's kind of I like to put them so that the cut side of the bale is facing up. And John, you've been on a baling rack as a kid, so you know how important it is to keep that cut side away from your legs when you're stacking bales, because it pokes you in the legs. Sometimes for city kids, they don't realize that there's a cut side and a folded side on that bale. So I just like to keep the cut side facing up. And if you look carefully, everybody can recognize that there's one side of the bale that looks like all the straws have been cut off, and the other side that all the straws have been folded over. And keep the cut side up. It allows water to enter easier from that end and the fertilizer to get worked down in there easier. But this is really not a deal breaker.
Okay.
Ideally, we want the strings not touching the ground because especially if they're hemp or natural fiber, they'll begin to decompose. They're natural material. So you don't want the strings to break is the important part, because you need the compression on that bale. You need that squeezing action because that helps accelerate this decomposition process. So we don't want to lose that compression, and therefore we try to keep the strings, so they're not touching the ground and rotting. And also when you go to plant in the top of that bale, you might be using a sharp, a trowel or something to help make a hole in the bale. And I don't want you to cut the strings. Other than that, it's really kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It really isn't essential to this process, which way the bale is oriented. I've seen them be successful. No matter how people place them, they will work, but it just makes life a little easier if you get the cut side facing up. And then you can do either transplants once you're prepared. So, if you buy pre-started vegetables in flats or in what we call bedding plants, those work great. You just kind of squish a hole into the bale and stick the roots down in there. And it kind of helps sometimes to put a handful of potting mix around the roots. You don't want to use a shovel of soil from your garden because that's going to have weed seeds in it. One of the biggest advantages of the straw bale garden method is you don't have weeds in a vegetable garden, so you don't have to pull weeds. So we don't want to start introducing soil from our garden on top of the bales. I tell people, then you're just soil gardening 18 inches up in the air, 20 inches up in the air. You want to avoid traditional soil. Just get a bag of potting mix from your store, and they can use a couple handfuls of it after they've transplanted. Just kind of pack in the roots to keep the roots from being exposed to the air. It kind of holds moisture around it, but the roots will grow very rapidly down into that straw bale. So and then if they're going to do seeds, if they're going to plant tiny seeds for plants that they normally would plant seeds in their traditional garden, then you need to make a little seed bed on top of the bales, and that's all that is potting mix. Just need an inch or so, maybe 3/4 or an inch and a half of traditional potting, germination mix or potting mix or whatever you have available in the store. Usually it's got a lot of peat moss in it typically. And then they pack that down. I just use a chunk of board, works well, and kind of pack it down really well in the straw, and then dibble some little holes and put their seeds in there. Or if you're seeding something really fine like carrots, just kind of sprinkle it over the top, and you're going to come back later and thin those out anyway. It's hard to get just the right number of carrot seeds on a surface that you're planting. So Usually I come back with a sharp pointed scissors after a couple weeks and snip off the ones that I don't want. And that thins them out a little bit and makes it nicer. But bigger seeds like peas and beans, you can actually probably get by without the potting mix. You just kind of poke it, 2 knuckles deep into the bale, and 3 days later they're already sprouting out. The seeds are big enough that they'll hold their position down inside of the straw bale. But the little tiny, anything with a fine seed, you're going to want a little seed bed. Just holds moisture around them. It keeps the seed in position and it gives you a more higher percentage of germination. Just like in a traditional garden, when those little seeds come up and your little peas are just poking out, that's the time when the rabbits love to come to the garden, and they'll jump up on a straw bale just like they will in a traditional garden, and they'll eat, when they're real tiny and they're just poking their heads up, they can eat 50 of those little seeds without any trouble at all. So you got to look out for livestock in the garden, just like you do in a traditional garden when those seeds are first emerging. But after that, a couple weeks later, they might come and eat something out of your garden, but at least they can't eat 50 of your seeds that have just poked their heads up. For me, I prevent rabbits. I use upside down plastic forks, stick those in the top of the bale, kind of around the edges especially, and they'll jump up because they can't see where they're going to land, and it'll poke them, and then they jump off, and you only need them there for about 2 weeks, and the rabbits train themselves not to go up on top of the bale. So that works good for cats too. I've had people that have cats that like to go up on top because there's that soft potting mix on top of the bales. So a couple plastic forks, and then just keep a box of them in your garden shed, and you can use them every spring for garden protection from rabbits and cats, neighbor cats or whatever. So.
One of the really interesting aspects of straw bale gardening that I like is the aspect of watering. So could you talk a little bit about some different watering setups and options that you could do?
Yeah, most people when they start out, they end up either watering by hand, which is certainly acceptable, but you have to be very diligent because, a couple of hot days in the sun and any garden will dry out. And a straw bale garden's, similar to other gardens. Now, a dry bale of straw, if you weigh it and then you get it nice and saturated and soaked and weigh it again, that'll tell you how much water is held inside of that bale because you can go by the weight of water and do the math. And a typical bale of straw, a typical size dry bale of straw will hold about right around 5 to 7 gallons of water inside that bale when it's totally saturated. So a bale will hold on to water pretty well once it's good and soaked. But once it's completely saturated, John, it won't hold another drop. And that's the good thing about straw bales is if you get too much rain, if you get a 7-inch overnight rainfall, your soil gardens might be flooded everywhere. Where as long as the bales are not completely underwater, the bales will survive just fine. I have a bunch of people in the Holland region of the Netherlands where they have this problem. Every spring they get heavy rains and even not so heavy rains, but Holland, if you know anything about that region of the Netherlands, is so flat that if you get an 8-inch rainfall, it literally goes 80 miles in every direction. And so if you've got a vegetable garden planted in the soil, you have to have a dike system around it and pumps and all this kind of stuff. Instead, they just put their vegetables now in straw bales, and the water will come up, 8 or 10 inches along the edges of the straw bale, and then 10 days later it goes away, and you have a beautiful garden the rest of the year. But it's that 10 days late every spring when you get your spring rains, everybody's garden gets flooded. And so I got a couple people that started using this technique over there, and now it's spread all over. So they've really adopted it very much so in that region. So it can work like that anywhere. If you get heavy rainfall, your garden will survive just fine. Now, for watering, most people start with a soaker hose. If they're not hand watering, they'll use a soaker hose, and that's a good way to do it. But get in your mind that you're going to have to replace that soaker hose pretty much every year. And if you're using well water or, water that you're pumping out of the ground, it's not being filtered, it might have some iron or calcium deposits in it, and that's going to plug up those soaker hoses pretty easily. And so it's kind of a constant battle. If you're using a soaker hose, you got to flush it out every couple weeks to make sure it doesn't get plugged up. And then I like to put that on a hose end timer that you can program, and it'll set it to go off, twice a week. Early in the spring and in the fall, you probably only need once a week or twice a week. And just run it long enough that each bale gets 1 gallon. That's really all you want. Very often, what I've discovered is new straw bale gardeners, the biggest mistake they make is they overwater. And that's a very common mistake. And the reason they overwater is because they have read in the book where it says you can't flood the straw bale gardens, so I'll just water for an hour. Well, what does happen if you overwater is the water will run out the bale, but it will carry out with it some of the nutrients and the little fine soil particles that are beginning to develop inside of that bale. And so if they overwater, it gives you symptoms that look like it hasn't been watered enough. In other words, the plants will droop, but they're drooping not because of lack of water. They're drooping because of this cold water applied to them for an hour. They weren't thirsty anymore after the first 5 minutes. They had a gallon of water in their roots, and the bale was refilled with water. And now for the next 55 minutes, this water's been running over their roots and down out the bottom, and they're being sort of the soil's being washed away from their roots. And so they'll droop and they look like they haven't had enough water. So then tomorrow you water for an hour and a half, right? That's people's instinct, is to increase the amount of water. So that's the biggest mistake people typically make, is they overwater. Now, if you use a drip system, that's probably ideal. That's even better than a soaker hose, because a drip system, you can now put an emitter next to each plant that you put into the bales. And these are fairly inexpensive. They're much more expensive than a soaker hose, but for a 20 bale garden, it's usually around $50 to $60. You can set one of these drip systems up. Just get one of the little tools and you can punch a hole in the pipes, and then you put the little connectors in there and you run an emitter over. Now, next to your tomato plant, you might put a 3 or 4 gallon per hour emitter, and next to a potato, you might only put a half a gallon per hour. So you're only going to run it for 5 minutes anyway, but now every plant gets the right proportion of water. If you've got a soaker hose, you kind of have to water to the least common denominator, and that's usually a tomato needs a lot of water. So you're going to water so the tomato isn't thirsty, but now the potato's got too much, and the other plants get too much. So it does take a little bit of trial and error to get that down, but I'll tell you again with emphasis, 1 gallon per bale every time you water. So this is easy math. Mm-hmm. People can take a bucket and stick it underneath their spigot, and they can figure out, okay, if I turn this spigot on, how many gallons a minute am I going to get? Now you do the math. You got 10 bales. You need 1 gallon per bale, so you need 10 gallons of water, and your faucet's giving you 2 gallons a minute, so you only have to run it for 5 minutes. Your plants will droop a little bit if they get thirsty. They'll tend to wither a little bit. Now, that's okay. People get worried when a plant shows signs of needing water. That's okay. As long as it doesn't happen often, and as long as you learn to recognize it. Sometimes what I use up here are indicator plants that will tend to droop very quickly if they don't have water. And I'll put one of those on top of the bale, like an impatient flower works really well for this. They're very shallow rooted and they need lots of moisture. So if they're in a sunny vegetable garden and your impatiens starts to droop, that's the first sign that maybe other plants are going to need water too. So it's kind of a good indicator of when to get out there and water your garden. But of all the complications of straw bale gardening, which there aren't very many, there's a lot of good things, but the one thing that people do tend to do is they water too much. And I know that it doesn't, because I write in the book that you can't overwater a straw bale garden. Of course, now everybody says, well, now you're telling us we water too much. But you got to understand that there's a difference here. What I'm trying to say when I say you can't flood a straw bale garden is, if you do have a flooding rain, or you accidentally left your soaker hose run overnight all night one night, and you put way too much water on the garden, it's not going to die. If you did that in a traditional garden, you went out the next morning, you might have literally standing water in your garden, and you've got dead vegetable plants everywhere. That's not going to happen in a straw bale garden. But you can overwater. If you water too much, it's gonna hurt your garden. So
yeah, I've been there with a traditional garden and overwatering with a soaker hose. So
yeah,
that was,
everybody's done that, I think, John. Left it on overnight, forgot all about it.
Yeah, we had a drought one year, and I thought, I'll put in soaker hoses. It'll be great. And yep.
You wake up at 2:30 in the morning, you startle awake, and you say, oh my God, I forgot those hoses were on. Run out there in your pajamas to shut the hoses off. Yeah.
Yep. During the gardening season, aside from watering, what are some other care tips that you would have for straw bale gardening?
Besides the overwatering, but a little bit of maintenance. fertilizing is not a bad thing, especially if you have gotten a lot of rain. Very often that will leach out some of your nitrogen.
Yeah.
So that's sometimes not a bad idea to add a little bit of nitrogen here and there. There's no weeds to pull, which is a wonderful thing. I like to encourage people to build a trellis above the bales, and I show you how to do that in my a very simple way. There's several ways to do it, but building a pretty simple trellis. And then part of the maintenance process is out there and making sure that the vines are climbing up that trellis. So try to keep your tomato vines, weaved in and out of that trellis. And I like to tie my potato vines up on that trellis. Your peas and beans, of course, will climb up there naturally. My squash vines, I get those to climb up on that trellis to get that foliage up in the air and off of the ground. That really does change the culture of your vegetable garden. What I mean by that is, if you have vines that are spread all over the ground around your vegetable garden, if you're a squash grower and a cucumber grower, that's typically up here. What people did is they just let the vines run across the ground. They might try to figure out some way to get the vines up, but usually they end up on the ground. And then, of course, moisture accumulates around those vines, and that's a perfect growing environment for diseases and insects to flourish on those crops. If you get those vines up in the air on that trellis, now you get really good air circulation around those vines. And with that air circulation, the leaves tend to stay drier. The foliage tends to stay drier, which is a much better culture for a vegetable garden. And then if you do see insect problems, if your vines are on the ground in a great big vine field, you're probably not going to get down on your hands and knees and crawl around in your squash vines every day to see if there are insect problems. But if those vines are hanging up on a trellis and you walk through that garden, those vines are going to be brushing your shoulder as you walk through the garden, and you're going to see any insects that have come to your garden and started to accumulate. And then you can act quickly, usually with a more mild insecticide without having to turn into anything too strong. You can go get some insecticidal soap or neem oil, and you can get really thorough coverage by walking along one side of the trellis, and then you go to the other side of the trellis. And you can literally get 100% of that foliage covered with that insecticidal soap so that you get contact with the insects or contact the disease problems that you're trying to treat. If those vines are on the ground, you're going to spray those vines, but you're only going to get the tops of the leaves. And those insects can hide out underneath. And then as soon as it dries out, they come back up on the surface. So you have to get those milder insecticides usually have to contact the insect to have an effect. And so by getting those vines up in the air, you detect problems earlier and you can treat them more thoroughly. So that's from a maintenance standpoint, really it's about that trellis, getting vines up on that trellis. And then if you do have any maintenance, you're gonna have less problems with insects and diseases, especially if you don't use a overhead sprinkler. I drive by people's vegetable gardens in the summer and I see the sprinkler going off in their garden. And I understand they have to water their garden, right? But I just would love to stop them and say, from a horticultural standpoint, this is the worst thing you can do to your garden is water with an overhead sprinkler. It's really a no-no. It spreads disease like crazy. And, especially if they're watering at, 8 o'clock at night and it's going to get dark at 9 o'clock and they're going to have wet leaves all night long. You're just creating petri dishes on top of these leaves for this disease problems, fungal diseases and things to just flourish on top of those leaves. You want dry leaves as much as possible. And so no overhead sprinklers, and for sure, no garden watering before dark, because now you're going to have wet leaves all night long. There's no sun to dry them off. So it's really a bad time of day to be watering and a bad method to use if you're using a sprinkler. So I really encourage people, soaker hose or drip style. You do a soaker hose first because they got to convince themselves that this straw bale gardening is something they want to do long term, and then eventually the next time they'll buy a drip system, they'll sort of upgrade, and then that'll last for a long time. I've had mine for 12 years, and you replace an emitter every couple of emitters every summer, and that's about it for maintenance on that. So they do last much longer. And once you get it set up, great thing about straw bales, you don't have to worry about crop rotation. So I can put a bale in that garden underneath that same emitter, and I put a tomato in the same exact spot every year. So I have a plan for what plants go where in my garden, and I just repeat it over and over. So once you get it figured out, you can make a map, and you never have to rotate crops in your garden, which is something that as a traditional gardener you could never get by with. You must rotate crops or you're going to have failure, in your garden. Where with straw bale gardening, we don't worry about that at all. So
once you get to fall, what can you do with your spent straw bales?
Well, you definitely don't want to throw them away. I always
Yeah.
tell people you've created the most beautiful compost that you'll ever see, especially by the end of the second year. Sometimes you can use a bale for 2 years. It might take some reconnoitering, which is, I say, where you take 2 or 3 bales and you kind of squeeze them together, and then you maybe put some chicken wire around them, works really well. And then what I like to do is overlap the ends of the chicken wire and then staple that onto a 2x2 and then twist the 2x2, and it sort of pinches, it gathers up this chicken wire and squeezes that bunch of straw together. And your bales will end up round at that point, but who cares? They work really well the second year for root crops, for planting potatoes and carrots and beets, because that straw is not going to heat up again the second year. The first year it gets really hot. The tomatoes and the cucumbers and the squash, they love that. They love warm feet. But other crops like potatoes, you have to wait so long in a first year bale until that bale completely cools off before you can plant. If you don't wait, you will cook your potato. And by tomorrow, that seed potato will be a baked potato. So you need to wait for it to really cool off. Well, if you're using second year bales, now you don't need to worry about that. You just plant those potatoes real early in the spring, all the way to the bottom of that round, quote unquote, bale, sort of a squeezed together group of 3 bales. Plant those potatoes way down at the bottom and leave the hole open, and it'll climb 13, 14, 15 inches all the way to the surface and then creates its vine. But now you've got this long stem from where the root is, and it creates chits all the way up, and you'll get a bunch of potatoes. I mean, each bale will give you close to a bushel of potatoes. So, that's an easy way to do root crops in a second year bale. And then by the end of that second year, you'll see that bale has really broken down at that point. And there'll be a few stems in there so you can tell it came from straw. But if you dig your hands down into those bales, it really has melted down and just made this beautiful compost. Now, I get people on our Facebook page that will use them a third year. And now they'll put them into some kind of a trough that they build out of, recycled pallets. They'll cut the pallets in half and they make a little, almost like a bin that they put them in, a long row. And they'll toss them in that and they use them again. And then they put a fresh bale on top of that or more straw on top of it the next year. But when this stuff gets broken down, I'm telling you, it makes the most beautiful, even like germination mix. I was reading in some old horticulture books from the 1930s, and this was before they had greenhouse supply companies, like we buy stuff from now. You call your greenhouse supply company and you order germination mix, right? Well, in the old days, when they first built greenhouses and they didn't have greenhouse suppliers, they would make their own germination mix. And one of the ways they did that was by rotting straw, because after 2 years or so of composting straw, pure straw or grass, it makes the most beautiful compost, and it's nice and clean. So there's not a lot of weed seeds in it. And anything that is a weed seed has already sprouted after 3 years because it's just such a beautiful broken down compost. And then you use that to fill make your seeds, start your seeds, to fill whatever containers it is that you're growing in. And in the old days, they made those out of paper, of course. All the seed trays were made out of paper. But, just fascinating to see how they used straw back then. But we still today can get by using that. So when I'm done with my straw bale garden, I don't throw that stuff away. I use it to fill my containers on my patio. Like normal people would go buy a bag of, potting mix at the garden center. I fill it up with straw bale compost and I use it again one more year. Now, it doesn't hold up like a good bag of Miracle-Gro potting mix, which has a lot of, it has a lot of peat moss in it, so it breaks down more slowly and it holds its structure really well. This doesn't hold its structure very well, and it will compact and it will get sort of mucky and muddy in there. So you really can only use it 1 year in a container. Mm-hmm. And then it doesn't drain as well as it should after that, but it works great for 1 year for sure. And since I have a unlimited supply of it, I just dump all my containers out and fill up with fresh compost from my straw bale garden, and I use it for 1 year. Window boxes, all my window boxes get that in. any hanging plants I do, hanging baskets, I repot potting, I repot house plants in straw bale compost. So you really can use it for almost anything. It works
Yep.
great.
And just kind of talking there about reusing bales the second year and kind of
Mm-hmm.
making a DIY bale. And I know in the book you talk about kind of making your own straw bales, and this is really where your idea of straw bale gardening is kind of spread all over the world as far
Right.
as using different types of materials. Um,
Right.
with
Yeah.
with reading your book, I went to the Dominican Republic a few years ago, and something that they have there is tons of sugar cane, and
Yep.
a lot of that pulp they just burn at the end of the season. I'm thinking they could be using that, like composting it and using it for something, and
Yep.
I think that idea would apply perfectly there.
Yeah, we have lots of folks in Australia, New Zealand, and actually some in the Dominican Republic that are using sugarcane stalks,
That's very
and making
awesome.
them into bales and using it. So basically, like I said earlier, you can a bale, a straw bale. Essentially, you can use any organic material. So what I encourage people to do in my book in that make your own bales section, and I do this myself, is in the fall of the year, I'll collect, I take my bagger mower, my little push mower, and I go over top of my hostas once they've frozen and the leaves have started to, die back, and I'll mow off all my perennial garden. So I'm chopping up hostas and astilbes and, daylilies, and all the leftover foliage gets chopped up and sucked into this bag on my mower. Then I dump all that into a great big Rubbermaid bin. These storage bins. I tell
Mm.
people, go down in the basement and dump all your Christmas decorations out and use that great big bin to make some bales, because that's really all you need is a big 40, 50 quart Rubbermaid bin. And then you have to compress that straw into that bin. So that might mean jumping up and down on it. I show people in my book how to build a little, really it's a baler, but it's just a giant lever that you attach to something so you can push down on it and really get a nice tight squeeze. And then what I've discovered the last year or two, and actually this was somebody wrote me a note about this and said, you should suggest to people that they fill that tub with water. So if you're not making a whole bunch of them in one day, you're just making one at a time, is to fill that bucket up with water and put a rock on top and leave it overnight, so that all that vegetation that you've squished down into this bale. And I mean, we're talking about leaves and grass clippings and,
Mm.
whatever you can find, your trimmings off of your lilac bush, anything you have that will decompose can go in this bucket and get squished. And then you leave it soak overnight with a rock on top, dump it out the next day, and then you'll have this square brick of organic material. You need to wrap that again with the chicken wire and then
Mm.
staple the two ends of that chicken wire onto a 2x2. Then I use a wrench on it and I just turn that 2x2 and it'll squeeze that really tight. It's like a vice. It just squeezes around that bale. Then I leave a sharp pointed end of that stick out the bottom of the fence so that I have enough I can pound it in the ground. So once I pound that stake in the ground, then it won't untwist, and you have this bale, held together by the chicken wire, so you don't have to put strings and stuff around it necessarily, and it works beautiful. You treat it exactly like you would the straw bale. You put the fertilizer and water on it for 2 weeks, and it really begins to decompose. Now, when you get really fancy at making these, you can actually mix the fertilizer right in as you're making the bale. So you've got a little bag of fertilizer sitting by the bale maker, and every time you put a layer in, you just toss a little bit on top till you got about 2 cups of lawn fertilizer in there. Or if you're using blood meal, you need about 7, 8 cups of blood meal. Mix that in with this big bale, and now all you got to do is add a little water, and the fertilizer is all mixed in there already. You add a little water, and those microbes will very rapidly begin to decompose that bale. And now you've made a bale that essentially costs you nothing, maybe 30 cents for the chicken wire, but you can reuse that, over and over again. I just untwist it and set it aside. You can use that exact same chicken wire the next year to make another homemade bale. So, here we're lucky in the United States because we have a garden center. We can come down to your guys' garden center and we can buy some bales of straw and we can go home and give this thing a try, for $20 or whatever. Buy a couple of bales and go home and give it a go. But there are a lot of places on planet Earth, John, where they don't have John Deere balers, and there's no, New Holland baler parked behind the machine shed. They don't even have tractors. A lot of these people we're dealing with over in Cambodia and the Philippines are still farming with oxen and growing rice. That's their main crop. Well, they have lots of rice straw, so that's not a problem. But the problem is they've never heard of a bale. They just let the straw sit in the field, and then the next year before they plant, they burn it all off. They light their field on fire, and it all burns off. It's bad for the environment, but it's part of their culture. They've been doing the same thing for 1,000 years. They've been growing rice in that same rice paddy, and they do the same thing every year. So now here comes this Western guy along, and we teach him how to take that rice straw and make it into a bale. And we use a little homemade wooden baler, which makes bales much more quickly, and you can get them compressed really nice if you use this. And we give them the plans. They all have cell phones now over there, so they can look it up on YouTube and they can follow the plans for how to make it. So they go cut down some bamboo in the woods, and they make one of these balers essentially out of wood, to squish these bales together. And once they get the bales made, part of the problem in parts of the Asia, like Cambodia, where we are, is that they have lots of flooding. So for about 2.5 months, much of their good soil that they normally would grow vegetables or grow crops is underwater. It's 6-8 feet underwater. So what we did is we took a backhoe and we would dig a great big hole in their farm, about 35 feet by 35 feet and 15 feet deep. And then we'd pile all that soil up right next to the hole and make a mound that was above that highest flood level. Then we'd take the bales made by hand from their rice straw, and put those bales up on top of that mound. So now when the monsoon rains come, it's raining, 10 inches in a day, but the water, as soon as it stops raining, the water quickly filters out of that straw bale, runs off of the mound so that the straw bales are above that mound and dry. And it's nice and bright, sunny the rest of the day, and their vegetables do just fine. It dries out quickly enough and gets enough air back into that bale that the roots survive just fine. And so they can now, during the flood season, they can grow crops like the squash and beans and peas and lots of leafy greens, vegetables. So, there's a huge problem with rural Cambodians, and they're some of the most malnourished people, farmers and their children, most malnourished people on earth, because they're so far from cities that they can't get food aid. They're in very remote locations. And when there's floods everywhere, how do you get food aid to these remote locations? So these people for 5 months live off of nothing but rice, which they have stored, but that's not healthy at all for 5 months. And their kids begin to show signs of malnourishment by the time this 5 months is over and things dry. Now, when the floods go away, then guess what happens? It gets dry as a bone, and there's droughts. So they don't have access to pumps and wells like we do. And so they can't water their crops, and it's 110 degrees in the shade every day. But now we've dug a giant pit in the ground. So guess who has a great big storage tank filled with flood water that they can still dunk a pail in there and go to the top of this mound and keep their vegetable garden watered up on top of this mound. So it's really filling a food production gap in this population in Cambodia. We went from 0 farmers. We now have over 4,000 farmers over there that have adopted this and are doing this. And it costs them nothing. It costs them 0 to do this. They have to get this hole dug, which the government is providing the grants to do this. So this guy he digs 2 holes a day. He's got a great big Komatsu backhoe, and they actually have 4 of them working over there, and they go around the country and they're digging these holes for these farmers. And it's like making them a sustainable operation that they don't have to rely on a third party or other countries to provide them with food. Mm-hmm. Which is a very important thing. I don't want to talk about politics on a gardening show, but until you can feed yourself as a population, you are never going to be free from your government. Your government will always control you much more easily by controlling your food supply than they can with weapons. We're seeing that right now in Venezuela. The same thing is happening. When your government controls your food, they control you. There's no way to be free until you can figure out how to grow and provide yourself some type of food. And so this is a great thing, not only for them to be able to fill that food gap for that 5 months, but to really bring them for the first time true democracy to countries like Cambodia. So to me, it's a lifelong passion. And I never dreamed that straw bale gardening would become what it's become. And I certainly never dreamed that this would begin having an impact on world hunger.
Yeah.
But I just did a TED talk about this, actually. If you're familiar with TEDx talks, if anybody's familiar out there that listens to your show, they can go on YouTube and they can look for TEDx and then Google straw bale gardening or search for straw bale gardening on YouTube, and they can watch my TEDx talk where I talk more about this and our project in the Philippines. And we have projects actually in a whole bunch of countries around the world at this point where straw bale gardening is really having an impact on providing food for these people who can't feed themselves. They don't own any land. They don't own any tools. They don't have access to much water. Their water is difficult to get and they don't have a lot of it. So with straw bale gardening, you don't need land. You don't need any tools. They can get the straw bales for free, essentially. They gather up grass and leaves and rice straw and they make these bales and they put them right outside their house. And their starter fertilizer, they use urine, human urine, 12% nitrogen. So they use urine on these bales, and they need about 6 liters or so over 10 days, which is a lot. And but that gets that bacteria fed inside the bales, and it will grow, and it starts to decompose and become soil. It's not going to hurt your plants at all. Your plants aren't going to have urine in them. It's all chemistry. It all dissolves, and that's providing them, within 60 days of when we teach them how to do this, they're already harvesting lettuce for the first time that they've grown themselves, and cucumbers a short time later, and they love squash, all kinds of different squash. And they love this plant called bitter gourd, which they all go nuts over there. So now you teach one poor person in a poor neighborhood how to do this, and it spreads like wildfire because their neighbors see that they can do this also. So they learn from each other, and the method just sort of passes along. So we hope in 5 or 10 years that this could really become something that even people in urban environments in the city could be doing this and providing food for their own family right off their back porch.
I mean, it's amazing. We started talking about something as simple as an observation on the farm when you was a kid, and now we've ended with, tackling world hunger. And I just want to thank you for sharing this on the podcast.
Sure, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to be here. It's wonderful. I like to spread the word wherever I can, so I take every opportunity I can get. So,
thank you. All right. Before I go, how can people find you online?
Really easy. They can Google me. They can go to my website, strawbalegardens.com, and they can link to everything from there. We have presence in all social media, and basically, if they Google straw bale gardening, they will find me. I'm everywhere out there. So, yeah, I'm an easy guy to get a hold of. And if you look on my website, you can even find my phone number. I tell people that, and they think I'm crazy for giving out my phone number. But I get calls. I don't mind taking people's calls. I'll spend 5 minutes talking to somebody and helping them through a problem or whatever. And I figure that's what I get paid for. I sold them a book, and they looked up my phone number, and they got a question that they couldn't get answered by reading my book. Then, I owe them an answer. So they give me a call. I have no problem with that. I talk to people all day long, probably 20, 30 people a day every day in the spring. So if somebody needs to reach me, they can email me. That's the easiest way. But they can also try and call me.
Again, I want to thank Joel for sharing this simple but revolutionary technique for growing vegetables. What stuck out for me is how a simple childhood observation led to the creation of straw bale gardening. I've talked previously on the podcast about my own experiences growing up on a farm and how it inspired me to study biology in college. Nature is perhaps one of the greatest teachers. This episode's gardening wisdom comes from Charlotte Mason, an educator in England at the turn of the 20th century. She writes, "An observant child should be put in the way of things worth observing. Until next time, keep observing and keep growing." For links, videos, and more about this episode, check out our show notes at bobsmarket.com/keepgrowing. If you're listening on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or other platforms, be sure to give us a review. You can also learn more about bulbs through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and more. If you want to contact me directly with questions, comments, or smart remarks, shoot me an email at keepgrowing@bulbsmarket.com. The music in this week's episode is by Silent Partner. Copyright 2019, Bulbs Market and Greenhouses, Incorporated.